Hello and welcome back. I was a little shocked to learn that in 1820 the global literacy rate was only around 12%. And when you look at the scriptures through the lens of literacy, which I'll admit is not the usual perspective, you uncover some interesting things. Now, although the global literacy rate was 12%, it was higher than that in the US and Europe, but it's hard to know exactly what a 12% literacy rate means in practical terms because the definition of literacy varies. But universal or nearly universal literacy is a fairly modern thing. As a sidebar comment, when we say that Joseph Smith only had a formal education through third grade, we might feel that that makes him uneducated. But as a comparison, Abe Lincoln claimed to have only 1 year of formal schooling. Only 5 to 10% of ancient Greeks could read and write. During Jesus' life in Palestine, the literacy rate was between 3 and 7%, and Jesus was one of very few who could read. Luke 4:16 says, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read." We usually assume he was a carpenter because that's what Joseph was. But to be literate enough to read in a synagogue or to have read enough at age 12 to discuss the gospel in the temple with wise men and scholars implies that Jesus had access to information that would not typically have been available to a carpenter's apprentice. It's not just that people didn't know how to read. For the most part, there wasn't anything to be read. 600 years earlier, in the days of Nephi and Lehi, the literacy rate in Egypt and Mesopotamia was between only 1 and 5%. Ancient Jerusalem is thought to have had a marginally higher literacy rate, but it was still very low, even lower than when Jesus was alive. As modern readers were impressed by Nephi's ability to make tools from ore and by his instant recognition of the fine steel of Laban's sword. These suggest, we say, that he might have been trained as a blacksmith. But his ability not only to read but to write was even more specialized than smithing abilities would have been. He tells us in verse 3 that he was among the literate few when he says, "And I know that the record which I make is true, and I make it with my own hand, and I make it according to my knowledge." At first, verse 3, where he says he's making his record with his own hand, might seem like a throwaway verse. But in the ancient world, where nearly everyone was illiterate, most writing was outsourced, and documents included a phrase that summarized who wrote it and on whose behalf they wrote it. The word for such a summary is a colophon, and ancient documents abound with them, and they didn't really disappear until the invention of the printing press. We also find colophons throughout the Book of Mormon, where authors such as Nephi, Enos, Zeniff, and Mormon announced that they were doing their own writing. In the case of Gadianhi, the governor, he says, "I have written this epistle, sealing it with mine own hand." It's unclear from this whether Gadianhi actually did the writing or whether he had it written and then signed it. But back to the topic, being able to write was apparently a big deal. In chapter 3, when Nephi was trying to persuade Laman and Lemuel to use their family's wealth to buy the brass plates from Laban, and let's not forget that Laman was the oldest, so the family's wealth was probably his inheritance. So when Nephi was trying to persuade his brothers to use their inheritance to buy the plates, he said, "And behold, it is wisdom in God that we should obtain these records, that we may preserve unto our children the language of our fathers." From that comment, where they talk about preserving their father's language for their children, it seems possible or even likely that many of the people in Lehi's group were literate. And it seems likely that after they arrived in the Americas, they did teach their children, so that a disproportionate number of Nephites were also literate. We obviously don't know a percentage, but it seems that Nephites were expected to know how to read. The Lamanites, not so much. We'll come back to that in a second. But the Nephites were expected to read. There are several places in the Book of Mormon where a prophet will ask the people he's addressing, "Have you not read?" or "Do we not read?" As just one example, in Alma 33, when Alma and Amulek are addressing a large group of people who were so impoverished that they weren't allowed in the synagogues, In Alma 33, verse 3, he asks this group, "Do ye remember to have read what Zenos the prophet of old has said concerning prayer or worship?" Based on this, it seems that even poor people had access to scriptures and knew how to read them. And this was 500 years after the boat landed. So literacy appears to have persisted from one generation to the next. And you'll find evidence of this all throughout the Book of Mormon. You have kings and generals and other leaders sending letters back and forth, sometimes reporting on battles, sometimes threatening each other. You have Captain Moroni writing his title of liberty on a banner. What good does it do to write words on a banner and wave it around if no one around you knows how to read? And when Korihor the Antichrist lost his ability to speak, he was able to communicate by writing. By contrast, the Mulekites, or the people of Zarahemla, arrived in the New World not long after Lehi's group, and they did not have a literacy tradition. When King Benjamin's father, who was named Mosiah, first found the people of Zarahemla, about 500 years after they arrived in the New World, their language had become so corrupt that they couldn't communicate with the Nephites or read what their ancestors had written. So when their two groups merged together, Mosiah taught the Nephite language to the people of Zarahemla. The Lamanites were another story, but an interesting one. For the most part, they apparently just lounged around in the wilderness, hunting, fighting, and so on. And there's no evidence of them reading or writing, at least not initially. Do you remember King Noah's wicked priests? After King Noah was killed, his priests were exiled by the Nephites. Being in exile, they abducted and married 24 Lamanite girls and disappeared with them into the wilderness. By the time the Lamanite armies found them, several years had passed, and their kidnapped wives had grown attached to their abductors, who were now their husbands, and they begged the Lamanite army not to kill their husbands. And since the Lamanites didn't know anything about Stockholm Syndrome, they forgave King Noah's priests for the kidnappings. So what does this have to do with language? Well, Mosiah 24:1 says that Amulon, the leader of King Noah's priests, gained favor in the eyes of the king of the Lamanites, so he appointed King Noah's priests to be teachers. And in chapter 24, it clarifies that they taught the Lamanites the language of Nephi. Here's verse 4. "And he appointed teachers of the brethren of Amulon in every land which was possessed by his people. And thus the language of Nephi began to be taught among the people of the Lamanites." And verse 6 is even more specific. It says they taught the Lamanites to read and write. But they taught them that they should keep their record and that they might write one to another. And then the next verses describe how once they were literate, the Lamanites began to trade and to increase in riches. To me, this kind of seems anticlimactic, that the priests of wicked King Noah eventually lived out their days as school teachers for the Lamanites. But what is this language that we're talking about? It seems that there were at least two. You had the language of the Nephites, which the Lamanites read and wrote, and which King Noah's priests taught to the Lamanites. But the language of the Lamanites does not seem to be the language in which Laban's brass plates were written. If we go back to 1 Nephi chapter 1, in verse 1, Nephi said, "I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father." He then elaborated on his father's language. He seemed to describe a system of writing in which the language was Hebrew, but the characters were Egyptian. He says, "Yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians." We see this idea again, the idea of writing with Egyptian characters, in Mosiah chapter 1, when King Benjamin explained why he had taught his sons Egyptian. Verse 4, "For it were not possible that our father Lehi could have remembered these things to have taught them to his children, except it were for the help of these plates," referring to the brass plates. "For he, having been taught in the language of the Egyptians, therefore he could read these engravings and teach them to his children, that thereby they could teach them to their children, and so fulfilling the commandments of God even down to this present time." So it seems that although nearly everyone was literate, the prophets and record keepers wrote on the plates using Egyptian characters. But why Egyptian? Toward the end of the Book of Mormon, Moroni explained that they wrote in Egyptian because it was more compact. Here's Mormon 9:32. "And now behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. and if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. It sounds like the language used for everyday writing was Hebrew. Continuing, but the Hebrew hath been altered by us also, and if we could have written in Hebrew, behold, you would have had no imperfection in our record. Going back to verse 32, it's interesting that he talks about using Egyptian characters. He doesn't say they wrote in the Egyptian language, only that they used Egyptian characters. That might help us better understand Nephi's phrasing in 1 Nephi 1:2 that we read a minute ago. Yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. So the language of his father is in the learning of the Jews. That's probably the Hebrew that Moroni was talking about, and the language of the Egyptians. So basically, it seems that they wrote in Hebrew using modified or reformed Egyptian characters. Just a quick comment. If Joseph Smith had fraudulently written the Book of Mormon, as the critics claim, the nuance of writing in Hebrew using Egyptian characters is kind of a strange arrangement for him to invent. I mean, why complicate things? The story's characters are from Jerusalem. Why do we have to throw Egyptian into the mix? Well, I went looking on Google and found an interesting rabbit hole to go down. I'll drop a link in the show notes. There are professors and other academics who study ancient records and do their best to translate or decipher them. The article, which is a Science Daily article from back in 2007, talks about some Egyptian hieroglyphs that the academics were unable to figure out until a professor of Egyptology from the University of Chicago emailed them asking whether the writings might be Semitic. And that clue allowed them to crack the code. As the article said, although written in Egyptian characters, the text turned out to be composed in the Semitic language spoken by the Canaanites in the 3rd millennium BCE, a very archaic form of the languages later known as Phoenician and Hebrew. So basically, the Chicago professor anticipated that although the characters were Egyptian, the underlying language might be Semitic, such as Hebrew or Arabic. How did this Chicago professor know to suggest this? Well, evidently, writing in Semitic or Hebrew using Egyptian characters was fairly standard practice. I've included a link to a second article that talks about this as well. So the professors trying to translate the Egyptian documents didn't know this. But Joseph Smith did, way back in 1820, and he tossed that detail into his story. For someone with a 3rd grade education, he sure knew a lot about writing systems from 3,000 years ago. So it seems that you had the language of the Nephites, which most of the people could read, and I guess the scriptures had been copied or translated into this language for them. It never really says how they read the scriptures. And you had the modified Egyptian characters that prophets such as Nephi, Mormon, and Moroni used to make the plates of Nephi. My point in making this video is that, unlike the rest of the ancient world, the Nephites could read. And from the perspective of our modern world, we might not appreciate how big of a deal that was. Just a couple of last quick thoughts that I'm not really sure how to categorize. Omni 125 talks about the gift of speaking with tongues. This is just a few generations after the boat landed. If everyone landed on the same boat and spoke the same language, what would be the point of the gift of tongues? Unless the Americas weren't actually empty when Nephi and Lehi arrived. And I talk about that in another video. Click the link in the top right corner if you want the video where we talk about that. Also, going back to where we started, as recently as 1820, the world's literacy rate was barely above single digits. But yet, in the Book of Mormon, the prophets prophesy about the book going forth to the world. How does a book go forth to the world when 90% of the world is illiterate? But yet, 200 years later, literacy is way up and the book is rolling forward. That's all I have for today. Hopefully you found this interesting, or maybe it generated more questions than answers. Either way, let me know. Subscribe if you want, and we'll see you next time.